Hi, good morning everyone, and we're starting our class, Shir, is learning Gemara, the only path to a spiritual life. Let's start with a exercise and self-evaluation, okay? Imagine that you're my 15-year-old daughter, and we're going away, you want to go to some friend's house, and before we leave, I want you to clean your room, okay? So here's what it looks like. I say, okay, Aviva, we're ready to go now. Please go clean up your room. Now, here's two approaches to how I would explain that to you. And I'd like you to listen. Again, imagine you're my 15-year-old daughter. Which one of these would motivate you faster? Choice number one is like this. Say, listen, Aviva, you know, Mommy worked so hard on your room. She set it up so carefully. You know how much love she put into everything. Please clean up your room. It'll mean so much to her. Please. Okay, that's choice number one. Choice number two is say, hey, listen, Aviva, we're not leaving until you clean up your room. That's a done deal. I'm not, you know, Mommy wants you to clean it. I want you to clean it. You got to get it done. So here's the choice. It's going to take you 3 minutes. You can go clean it for 3 minutes now, or we can argue for 15 minutes, and then you'll clean it. So take your choice, 3 minutes or 18. Okay, I can't see all your responses now, but feel free to respond which one you are. Which one worked better for you? The emotional pitch number one, which was, you know, how hard Mommy worked and what it would mean to her. That was an appeal to your heart. The second one was just a rational discussion. I just said, you know, look, which one you want, 3 or 18? That's who you are. If you pick choice number one, you're an emotional-based person, and that's what moves you more. If you pick choice number two, in all likelihood, again, you're a more rational-based person, or more logical. You know, more. That's what appeals to you better. I call it Word and Excel. You know, Word is more emotional, Excel is more, you know, literal and practical. Now, everybody has a little bit in them. Nobody's, you know, 100 to 0. You could be 60-40, you could be 70-30, you could be 95-5, but that's basically who you are. I give a 1-hour class in personality profiles, so we're not going to do all of it now, but basically, in a nutshell, Excel people just basically do best when you tell them what. Here's what I'd like you to do. Word people need to be told why. It's not enough to tell them what. You need to tell them why they should do it. And, you know, this is extremely important for the discussion that we're about to have about Chassidus and learning Gemara. Is Gemara the only way to go? Is it a path to spirituality? There's been a whole brouhaha, and a very healthy one, that's been going on, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But understanding, at least to start with, those personality pieces are so important to answering this and many other questions that you may have. One more before we get to the talk. There's a joke, a story told about these two fellows. A Hasidic guy was learning with a yeshiva type, you know, Lithuanian background, however you want to call it. In today's environment, so much of it blends between the two, as we'll see. But they were learning the Gemara. The Gemara says, the Talmud says that Yonasan ben Uziel, one of the great sages of the Talmud, the Gemara in Sukkah says, on Daf Chav Ches, on page 28, that when he would study Gemara, he would learn with such intensity that if a bird flew overhead, the bird would get burnt. Okay, the bird would die from the intense kedusha, holiness that was emanating from him. And you can interpret it allegorically or literally. But however, so these two fellows, a Hasidic guy and a yeshiva guy, were sitting and learning this Gemara. And the Hasidic guy says, he turns to his friend, he says, oh my goodness, look at this. Could you imagine the kedusha, the holiness that this fellow had, that a bird got destroyed, such kedusha? How could imagine a human being that was born just like you and I can become, you know, he goes on and on and on. And this yeshiva guy looks at him and he says, well, I'm really thinking about, would he be responsible for damages? Okay, is it a grumma, is it a secondary cause? But he didn't really kill it. It was just an offshoot of something that he did. So would he be responsible for damages? Okay, so you have the emotional and the rational. Again, and the background for this talk is an article that appeared in Mishpacha Magazine in the Shavuos issue, and everything I mention here I'll put in links at the bottom of this Facebook post so you can look them up yourself. And the same I'll do for YouTube. If you look in the comments section, I'm going to do source material so you can look this up yourself. But the Mishpacha posted a long piece called Meeting the Baal Shem Tov in 2018. It was in May, the Shavuos issue of Mishpacha Magazine. Rabbi, and they discussed what it's like nowadays, the quest for chassidus, the quest for spirituality. It was a long and very interesting article. Rabbi Noach Shafran, the Rebbe in Baltimore Yeshiva in Israel, wrote a letter to the editor, basically, and you know, not in so many words, but he said that learning is what we should do. If you want to communicate with God, God gave us His words. His Torah is the way to understand God. So, you know, it doesn't need, we don't need more than this. We have God's Torah. Why do we need more than this? So this, Rabbi Moshe Weinberger gave a class, a shiur on it. There's been some other articles. I'm going to put a link to Yehuda Oppenheimer, who wrote a piece in his blog on this. And there's been a lot of discussion about it. Rabbi Aaron Spivak, my 5th grade Rebbe for many years, I was in his 8th grade Rebbe in Yeshiva. He just asked me to mention that he had Rabbi Noach Shafran for a number of years in Baltimore Yeshiva in Israel, and what an amazing, amazing Rebbe he is. You know, just putting it out there. We shouldn't think that when he wrote Gemara only, that means he doesn't care about the emotional aspect. He said he was an amazing Rebbe in every which way. Okay, so what I would like to do, they were talking mostly in Hashkafa, in Jewish theology. Rabbi Weinberg spent his first class really talking about the idea, does God love everyone, source material, you know, of that nature. And that was the discussion until now. I would like to go to parenting and chinuch education, and in a very practical way talk about some takeaways from this. And I'd like to ask some questions and divide my talk into 3 parts and really try to explain things as I see them and offer you some practical applications for this in a very positive way. So the real question as I see it is, are we engaging the children's hearts enough? Are schools learning too much and not talking about God enough? Okay? Are we only engaging their minds? This is really the discussion. The whole article was about the hearts of people. Rabbi Shafran said, look, learn, you want to know God's heart? Learn through Torah. And Rabbi Weinberg said, no, are we doing this in our lives? Are we doing this with our children? Are we doing this with our students? Are we filling their minds and not speaking to their hearts? And this is not only an issue for non-Hasidim. Hasidim have the exact same issue. You know, there's a woman, Alison Joseph of Teaneck, has a wonderful program called Project Makom, where she works with Hasidish people from the Hasidish community who are either no longer observant or certainly abandoning Hasidic world, moving towards non-observance. And she basically says, you know, there's another way here. Why don't you try the modern Orthodox lifestyle or the yeshiva lifestyle? And she has a great program called Project Makom. You can look it up online. I actually did a class for her a few months ago in Muncie. I met with about 50 men, women, parents, all of them parents with children, who are going through all of this stuff. And they're also feeling, to some degree, a lack of, you know, this heart piece. And it reflects in so many ways. You know, I was asked, a parent who had a child in a Hasidic yeshiva asked me to go try to get him back in, and I met with the principal. The principal's a lovely guy, a wonderful educator. And he was telling me that, you know, the kid isn't studying that well, and he was telling me some difficulty the child had, and he was recommending that he go elsewhere. So I asked him, you know, I'm a little bit of a contrarian. I said, listen, I had this kid named Yisrael, and he's like a really nice kid. He's very spiritual. He loves to go into the forest and speak to God. and he's constantly working on his soul and his neshama. And he may not be the best student, but he's really a great kid. And he looked at me. He thought I was like teasing him. He said, you're describing this one. So I said, well, if you're rejecting him, Yisrael was the name of the Baal Shem Tov. It was his first name was Yisrael. I said, you just rejected the Baal Shem Tov. Remember the founder of Chassidus, who told people to talk to God and that there's meaning besides for only learning. We both had a great chuckle. He took him back in, actually. But so my first practical recommendation in talking about this all is to speak about God, to speak about why the children are learning. I mentioned earlier that Excel people need to be told what to do, clean up your room. Word people do much better when they're told why. Our kids, many of our kids go through 12 years of school here in America where they're basically told what. Here's what we're learning, and here's how we're davening, and here's what we're doing, and here's what Yiddishkeit is about. And not to say that it's not done in the most beautiful way. I think today's teachers and Rabbeim and Moras are amazing, certainly compared to what I had, 50 years ago. But they're great. They want to do the best thing. But then they go to Israel. They go through the gap year to Eretz Yisrael, and all of a sudden, they're talking about why. And the teachers get up and say, you can ask us anything. And a lot of the kids who've been in school all these years just get, honestly, they get disoriented. They say, why didn't they do this with me until now? And it's not necessarily children are asking bad questions. I don't believe that there are any bad questions. I always told my students, I have thousands of students out there. My life is a public record. You can ask any of them. I always told my kids, you can ask anything you want. If you want to ask it privately, you want to ask it publicly, but to give children a space to talk about the why. About 10 years ago, I was in my office meeting with a set of parents, and a 7th grader walked into my office, and he saw I was busy. He started to walk out. I said, can I interrupt for a minute? They said, sure. They were interviewing in the school. Sure, we'd like to see how you interact with the kids. So he walked in, and he said, well, I just asked my Rebbe. He didn't use the word bottom line, but I said, I just asked my Rebbe, why does the Gemara go back and forth and back? The Gemara is discussions. It's discussing a certain subject, a lot of circuitous logic and back and forth, and finally we come to a maskana, or the end, a conclusion. So he said, hey, I told my Rebbe, why don't you just bottom line it? He didn't say bottom line. He said, why don't you just get to the end? Why do we got to do all of this stuff? Now, Rebbe was pretty smart, and he said, why don't you go ask Rabbi Horowitz that question? So that's what he came to my office to ask. So I know in my days, if I would have asked a question like that, I probably would not have gotten such a great response. Those who are my age know exactly what that response would be. So I told him, I said, sorry kid, you're 850 years too late. The Rambam, Maimonides, basically, was wondering that same thing, and that's why he made the Mishnah Torah, which bottom lined, or gave a halacha, a final verdict, a psak, for the Gemara, for the discussions in the Gemara. So this kid tells me, he says, yeah, you're just saying that to make me feel good. He happened to have been a difficult child, this challenging child from a very, very challenging home situation. So he says, yeah, come on, you're just saying that to make me feel good. So I said, bring me a Gemara. I showed him the footnotes. On every page of Gemara, there's footnotes for the Rambam. I told him to go to the Beis Medrash, to the study hall, and bring back a Talmud, and a Rambam, and Maimonides, and I showed him what the Rambam does, that he bottom lines everything. So then he asks me, okay, so why do we have to do that? Why don't we just learn the Rambam? So I gave him a sports analogy. I explained certain rules. This kid was a wild football fan. I explained 2 or 3 football rules that if you don't know the reason for the rules, when they need to be applied in different situations, if all you know is the rule but not the why, you won't be able to apply them properly. So I explained, just like the Constitution is a document that was written, hundreds of years ago by brilliant people, and it's the America's Bible. This is what we go on. And scholars interpret what that word meant. What does the right to bear arms mean? The Chachamim gave us our Gemara, but we have to interpret it to modern day halachas, and I gave him examples of that. And then I brought him back into class and repeated this entire discussion to the class. So that's a why. When you suppress a question like this, the child, again, especially a child that's emotive, that's emotion-based, with words. But rational kids have the same rational question. So that's one piece of it. Speak to the children about why. Speak to the children about God, why it's important. We take it for granted that certain things are our bedrock, and they're so important to us, and it's so part of our DNA that we get offended when children ask reasonable questions about this. I had one of my star students. I taught 8th grade for 15 years, and I was a school principal for 20. And one of my star students, really top quality, the principal called me up. He went to a very good high school, and the principal called me up that this was a few months into 9th grade, that he was getting into all kinds of trouble. He got expelled a few times. I was so upset. And I said, there's something here that I don't know about. Anyway, I met with the kid, and I said, tell me, what happened? Yitzi, what happened? And he said that he went to his Rebbe, starting 9th grade. This was a brilliant student. He did amazingly well in Gemara for the years that he was in elementary school. So he told his 9th grade Rebbe, he said, Rebbe, I really want to get into learning Gemara. But I really want to understand why. Why are we spending this much time about it? Look, he told it to me very politely. Maybe he said it with a little bit of an edge. But that's what he asked his Rebbe, his teacher. He says to me, why do I need to tell me? Why is this so important? I really want to get good at this, and I know I'm going to be spending more and more time on it. And the Rebbe, brushed him off. And he said, Rabbi Moshe Weinberger didn't ask this question, or Baron Kotler didn't ask this question. He quoted Torah sages. So you little, 14-year-old kid, you're asking why you have to learn Gemara? These great sages didn't ask this question. And he was brokenhearted. He was so turned off and upset that his mind shut off. Now, I spoke to him, whatever. He shouldn't have done it. I spoke to the Rebbe. But stuff like this happens. And when children aren't asking these questions, sometimes it's sitting in them. So I think the first real practical application is that we need to speak to our children about why. Speak to them about God, about God's love for us. Speak to them about the reality, which Rabbi Moshe Weinberger discussed and was brought up in that letter to the editor also, about sinning, and that it's a process, and we try to become better people, and God loves us regardless. That's subject number one. Subject number two is really engaging their hearts. And, the story I told in the preview to this talk was a situation I had at the Aguda Convention in 1998. I gave a talk on teens at risk. And a Rosh Yeshiva, a head of a dean of a very large school that had, a top-tier school, wonderful man, came to me and said that he was just talking. He thanked me for my talk. Again, I was 38 years old. He really came and asked as a peer, as if he were a peer, asking, some real hard questions about teens at risk. And then as we were parting, he said, Rabbi Yakov, one thing that really bothers me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, he said, so many of my students are listening to English music, to general music, popular culture music, instead of Jewish music. And what I thought about it and what I think you should do. So I asked him, I said, Rebbe, Rosh Yeshiva, do you sing with your boys? Do you have a kumzitz? Do you get together and sing songs on a Thursday night or on a Motzai Shabbos or on a designated day? Do you bring somebody in with a guitar who's a charismatic person who could, engage the children's hearts? So he smiled, obviously he wasn't doing it. So I told him, I said, Rosh Yeshiva, you know what it's like? I said, this is like somebody who, it's like somebody, a car salesman who's complaining bitterly that nobody buys trucks from his business. But he doesn't have any trucks on the lot. So how could you expect people to buy something that you don't have? I said, Rosh Yeshiva, you're complaining that the boys' hearts are being engaged by popular music. You're not playing for their hearts. You're not even in the game. You're just you're just learning with them. You're appealing to their minds. You got their minds. You don't have all of their hearts. Their hearts are to somebody else's music. So, and, to his great credit, he actually did it. He set up, I met him a few years later, and he told me that he actually had set up a program for that. So, this whole piece, and I thought it was, this whole piece is so important, and I don't think we always spend enough time speaking about just engaging their hearts. Rabbi Yehuda Oppenheimer, I mentioned it earlier, he has a blog called Libi B'Mizrach. He wrote a long piece about this. He actually posted on my introductory video on Friday with a link to his post about this. And I had already prepared some of my notes in advance. I wrote Rav Shaga Feivel Mendelovich. Rabbi Mendelowitz was the old dean of Yeshiva Torah Vodaas. He passed away in 1948. I never met him. I was born in 1959. But every one of my Rabbeim in Torah Vodaas were his students. Every single one were students of his. So I got his second-hand vision. And embedded in Torah Vodaas was the notion of having different approaches, of having singing and a spark of Chassidus. It was primarily an American yeshiva, not a Chassidish yeshiva. But Rabbi Oppenheimer wrote it very beautifully, that he appealed to the different components of his students and sent them. It was really fascinating. Rabbi Heschel Mashinsky, who lived here in Monsey, I had the great privilege of teaching with him for a few years as colleagues. He passed away. He was a student of Rav Shaga Feivel. Rav Shaga Feivel Mendelovich, Rabbi Mendelowitz, sent him to the Kloisenberger Rebbe because Heschel Mashinsky, who wasn't Chassidish, had that emotive, that emotional base, and he said, you'll do very well in a Hasidish environment. And others he sent elsewhere. I remember Rav Nisanel Quinn, may Hashem forgive me, I was really not proud of it, but I wasn't a great student in high school. I really didn't learn much till about, I was 16 or so. I remember a class that Rav Quinn, Rav Nisanel Quinn, our high school principal, gave when I was in 9th or 10th grade. I was totally disinterested, not proud of it. I was sitting in the back, schmoozing, chatting with some friends, and he was teaching us Tehillim. And I'm going to get emotional, I'm sorry if I do. I remember him crying. I don't remember what he was saying. I think it was a pasuk in Tehillim about a bird looking for its mate, and us, I think that was the pasuk. It was about two birds looking for each other, missing each other, and about how we in Galus, today Shavas B'Tamas, we're in exile, and we should be yearning for God. I yearn for God like these birds. And he started crying, and he stopped for 2-3 minutes. I don't remember what he said. I remember that. I remember what an impression it made on me. I said, I wonder what those words are. So it took me maybe 10 years for it really to settle in. But that was also a part of the neshama, of the soul, that was built into the culture of yeshiva. Rabbi Mendelowitz had a lights out shalashudis that Rabbi Moshe Wolfson, Shlita, should live and be well, in Amunas Yisrael in Borough Park, it does the same thing. Basically they would daven mincha during daylight hours. They would wash, sit down for Suda Shlishis, for Shalashudis, as it's called, and it would get dark outside, and there were no lights in that room. In the dining room, the lights were off, so you would start seeing each other, and then it would be dark, and they would sing for 45 minutes. Try it once. It's amazing. My father, Olav Shalom, my father passed away when he was a young man. I was 3 years old. But Rabbi Mashinsky and the Bostoner Rebbe and Rabbanis Mandel of Yeshiva of Brooklyn, there were hundreds of his contemporaries who would talk about that Shalashudis. My father sang a Geshem and Talmud, and that my great-grandfather, Rabbi Shvishiva, wrote. He sang that every single Shalashudis. It's a song without words. I just posted a few weeks ago. My cousin Yakov Horowitz, we named for our grandfather. He at his chuppah. I just posted a few weeks ago. Our cousins, my cousins, my extended Horowitz family, singing that part of that song. The Boston Rebbe used to stop me at Aguda conventions. He would hold my hand and pat it like affectionately. He knew my father, and he would sing the song to me. And Rabbanis Mandel did, and This was part of the culture, that there was obviously an intent to engage their hearts. And I think that's something that's so important. I don't think we're doing enough of it. And, I'm going to speak at the end in practical terms. That's my second takeaway from this entire discussion, is that what we're seeing in this neo-chassidus is engaging hearts. That's really what it is. And if our children aren't getting it with us, either they're getting it elsewhere or they're just not getting it. And the last thing I'd like to talk about, it's something that's been on my heart and mind and pen, and later, first typewriter, then PC, is this whole issue of actually teaching Gemara and enabling our children to master it at an age-appropriate time. In my opinion, I think we're starting too early. I think we're learning too fast, all for the best of intentions. There's no educator in this country gets up in the morning and says, I'd like to mess up, a third of my class by teaching too fast. No, we all want what's best for our children. And when parents call the schools and say, you should be learning more Gemara, how come that school learns this amount of pages and we're learning only that? They also want what's best for the kids. But it's almost like a nuclear arms race, where we're going faster and faster and starting earlier and learning more. Look, again, I taught 8th grade, so many of the years I taught a weaker track, but I knew what the other track in the school did. So I started teaching 38 years ago. We learned almost no Tosfos in 8th grade. We learned Gemara and Rashi, once in a while a little Tosfos. We didn't learn as much in terms of time per day. I went to Yeshiva Tarvadas, a regular mainstream yeshiva. We finished at 6 o'clock in 12th grade. Sunday we were out at 1, Friday we were out at 12, Monday through Thursday was 6 o'clock. And all the serious learners went down to the Beis Medrash at 6 o'clock and learned till 1 in the morning. Like Rabbi Yisrael Reisman, Rabbi Shachni Weinberger, Rabbi Beroliner, all who have, who are very well known for their erudition, their learning, that being Talmidei Chachamim. They sat and learned. My friends and I went out to play ball until I got into learning when I was later on. But there was a baseline that, we learned Gemara 2 hours a day in 12th grade. 2 hours a day was mandatory. After that was voluntary. So if you weren't good in Gemara, it was almost lahavdil, like not being good in physics or in chemistry. You were able to have a good school day. If you're learning Gemara 7, 8 hours a day, if you're not good at Gemara, it's a very big problem. So I think it's about skills. It's about teaching children slowly and carefully, especially at the beginning, and giving them the skills to be able to learn well. One of my most powerful forces on shaping my educational philosophy was my experience in 9th grade. And what happened was, I went to Yeshiva Tarvadas all the years. We started in Crown Heights, then I went to Williamsburg, and then went to Beis Medrash back in Flatbush, and then the yeshiva in Williamsburg closed and moved to Flatbush. But we had about 30, 35 kids in 8th grade. And then when we went to 9th grade, people came from all around the country. So all of a sudden we went from having, 2 classes to 5. We had about 100 incoming 9th graders. And we had kids from Seattle, Washington, and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, all small towns that had small day schools. And it was really an eye-opening experience for me. Again, it took me many years to process this. But when I look back at my formative years, this shaped a lot of my educational philosophy. And here's exactly what happened. So we, New Yorkers, we all had learned tons of Gemara, 20, 30 pages. We learned a lot of, maybe it was less, but it was quite a bit of Gemara that we had learned in grade school, in grades 5 through 8. we came to ninth grade, so these kids from the out-of-town day schools had only learned 1 or 2 pages of Gemara because they were in co-ed classes, and they had much less time for Judaic studies. It was more balanced between Hebrew and English. Many of the kids that they were studying with in school came from non-observant homes. So we were like, okay, we're going to be really nice to these kids. We're going to help them out. We're going to reach out to them, and help them acclimate to yeshiva. We knew how to learn Gemara better than they did. In other words, we knew how to learn the logic and following. We were more familiar with Gemara. Here's the kicker. Then, one day, this I do remember until today, okay? It was 1973 when I was in ninth grade. Please don't do the math. And Rebbe said, okay, boys, prepare the next few lines of Gemara. Divide up into chavrusas, into study partners, and I want you to prepare the Gemara on your own. We didn't know how to do it. The day school kids did, because they learned very little, but what they learned was how to learn. And it was the exact same experience for Chumash. We had learned much more Chumash, but they were taught how to learn. The less Chumash that they learned prefix and suffix and word structure, and the same for Gemara. The steps were broken down the way they should have been, and then these kids were able to master it. So it very strongly shaped my educational philosophy. Later, when I started teaching the weaker track in the school, and I saw my students didn't know Gemara, I said, hey, why don't I do what those day schools kids did? And I started spending 2-3 weeks teaching kids like the day schools taught, slowly, carefully breaking down words in Hebrew and English, teaching them, the Hebrew and Aramaic for Gemara, for Chumash and Gemara. And the Bright Beginnings workbooks that we created are a result, an outgrowth of that educational philosophy. So that's what my third takeaway. Slow down, please. Slow down. Give them the skills. Teach them how to learn. You know something? One of the things that I mentioned at a staff meeting in my own yeshiva d'Achinom when we were laying out curriculum, I said, look, Rabbi, I said, Rebbeim, a 20-year-old with motivation and time could probably learn through all 8 years. This is what I told them, and this is how I wanted them to think. I said, a 20-year-old kid who's happy, well-adjusted, and has the skills can learn through everything we're going to teach them in 8 years. He can do that in 2 months. Okay? So, elementary school is not about covering ground. It's not about rushing. It's about giving them the skills. If they don't have those skills, they're learning-wise, they're crippled. So, slow down, give them skills, and give them options. You know, in Torah V'das, I don't know if folks know this, there was a smicha program. Rav Pam Zatzal did not give the top Gemara shir. Rabbi Chazan did. Rav Pam gave a smicha shir that was much more halacha based. So if you had that educational profile, that following the bouncing ball of Gemara logic and back and forth, if you were like that 7th grader that I spoke about who wanted to bottom line things and didn't do well with that Gemara logic, there was a smicha program. Now, they learned Gemara, they learned Chulin. It wasn't that they didn't learn Gemara, but there was another track. There were 2 tracks. The kids who loved Gemara went to the Gemara Shiurim, and the kids who were more halacha oriented went to learn that track. So that was an appropriate track that I think we should be encouraging kids who find Gemara difficult to do. So let me just review. Thank you for listening. Let me just review quickly. So number 1 was about engaging their hearts. Speak to your children. If you're a Rebbe, spend some time speaking about Hashem, about Yiddishkeit, about Hashkafa, about God. Allow them to ask questions, and many of us don't know all the answers to these questions, and that's fine. You can do what my 7th grade Rebbe did. The kid asked him a question about him that he wasn't comfortable answering and not answering in public. He said, go take it to the rabbi, go to Rabbi Horowitz. It's okay for you to, if your child asks a question like, did the Mabul really happen, the flood, Noah's flood, did the Jews really cross the sea, or is that just a story? And you don't have the answer, or who made God, or any of these questions, or how could God make the Holocaust? Kids have these questions. It's appropriate for them to have these questions. If they're thinking, they're going to have questions. If we don't allow them to ask the questions, they're just going to sit there unanswered. So don't be intimidated by questions. And again, it's the greatest modeling in the world, if you don't know an answer to a question, to tell the kids, let's go talk to someone who does. What a wonderful experience it would be for you to take your child, your 10-year-old or 15-year-old, and go together to a rabbi in the community who would be more well-versed in this. We're just rolling out a new website. It's thebrightbeginnings.com. We're doing forums for people to be able to ask questions to about over 50 forum leaders. One of the forum leaders is Rabbi Daniel Karupkin, who's the Rav in the Bayit, one of the largest schools in North America. He's a rabbi in the Bayit in Toronto. He's a master at Hashkafa, at Jewish theology, and I asked him to lead a forum on this. You can go to his forum and pose a question to him about any of these questions, or encourage your children to sit and type a question to him, and he can respond to you. So encourage questions. Don't be intimidated by them. Talk to the children about how Hashem loves us, and how our relationships, sometimes go here, and when kids go back and forth, and ebb and flow is part of a normal relationship. And a normal relationship is when you do have questions and sometimes even quarrel. Well, one of my friends said that, today Shavasa B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, the sad days that we observe, are also part of a vibrant relationship with God, where we have times where we're hurt and upset, and we need to talk it through, and then we have the comforting of Nachamu Ami afterwards. So encourage your children to do this. Engage their hearts, please. Please don't just teach them Gemara. If your school's doing it, fabulous. If your kids, if you're davening in a shul that has a very serious davening, that's a little on the dry side, everybody's really intense and they love davening, but there isn't that much for a child, and your kid says, can we go there? They sing more, they have a better kiddush, or whatever it is. Think about it. Expose your children to the neshama piece. Expose the children to that part that's so important, the emotional component. And the third thing is, please, I beg you, I'm not mentioning the books because I want you to buy them. I made the books because I've been writing about it for 30 years and no one else made it. So avail yourself of resources. A lot of this is free. You can go, I gave many classes on beginner learning that's absolutely free. I left some sheets there that are free. If you don't know it yourself, learn it yourself, and study beginner learning, beginner Chumash, beginner Gemara. If you look at some of the Baalei Tshuva yeshivas, the yeshiva for newly observant, some of them have fantastic programs for beginner learners, and after 6, 12, 18 months, some of those young men who go to that program are learning just as well and fast as others, or close to it. So it's all about the skills. Make sure your children have the skills, and if they don't have it, take a time out. The summer's a great time. Take them out of learning groups, wherever they are, and find someone who's going to tutor them in basics and beginner skills that they need so badly. And put your kids in schools that are appropriate for them. That's the last thing I'm going to ask you. And people always complain, the Rosh Yeshivas, why not the deans of schools, why don't they do this, why don't they do that? In the discussions about teens at risk that we had in the late 90s and shortly thereafter when I started speaking and lecturing about it, I met several times, probably 8 or 10 altogether over a span of 5-6 years, with the Me'etzes Gedolei HaTorah, with the leading Rosh Yeshiva of our generation, some of who are in Gan Eden, some of who Yibadel Chaim Tovim are still alive, and we talked about these issues. And I'll never forget, at one of the meetings, I asked the Rosh Yeshiva, I said, Rosh Yeshiva, I find, there are some high schools that start slower, and kids who are not doing that well in Gemara would do very well going to those schools. And some of the schools are going faster, and a lot of the parents, this was my quote to the Rosh Yeshiva, I said, Rosh Yeshiva, so many of the parents are placing their children in schools that are not appropriate for them. It's too hard for them, and they're struggling. Please, when you speak, I said, Rosh Yeshiva, you have a public voice. Please beg parents to place them in schools that are appropriate for them and not try to get them all into the Harvard, the equivalent of the top tier schools that they're just not going to do well. We know they're not going to do well. We 8th grade Rabbeim know they're not going to do well there. We try to encourage the parents to place them in a school where they'll be able to learn skills and go slower. And they don't want to hear about it. And they call the schools and beg them to take them in. They get offended when they say, your son's not going to do well here. And sometimes that's best. I will never, ever forget it. The Novominsker Rebbe, Shlita, the Novominsker Rebbe looked at me in frustration. He says, Rabbi Yakov, I tell them this. Mefolk mach nicht. I promise that was his exact quote. It was probably in 2000, 2001 or so. I asked him, please tell the parents that they should place their children in appropriate schools, not try to push them into schools where they won't be able to succeed. I said, it's so frustrating for us that we try to place them in appropriate schools, and then parents go to other schools because, parents want what's best for the kids. Of course, they're not doing it. They love the kids as much more than I do. But they're wanting the best for the children means getting them into Yeshiva X, where they're not going to be able to succeed. And the Rebbe turned to me in frustration. He says, I tell them this. They don't listen to me. Rabbi Yaakov, mefolk mach nicht. I promise. He said, Die schreib, you write about it. Maybe they'll listen to you. And I looked around at the other Rosh Yeshiva. Every single one was nodding their head. Every single one. So this isn't something that, I'm just coming up with. It's a real issue. So do what's appropriate for your children. Make sure they have the skills. As again, like I said, summertime is such a good time for this. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found it thought-provoking. And perhaps to give a different light in this neo-chassidus. That neo-chassidus perhaps is a search for that emotion. It's a search for the heart. It's a search for a connection with God. That, as I said earlier, maybe the kids are learning stuff, good stuff, Torah stuff, for 12 years in our schools. And until they get to Eretz Yisrael, they're not getting enough discussion about why they're doing it. Maybe they're not doing, well in other areas and are looking for shleimus. They're looking for fulfillment in other areas of Yiddishkeit because Gemara doesn't work for them. And like I said earlier, according to their educational profile, some kids really might always struggle with Gemara. If you went to the local high school, the local public high school here, and you took 100% of all the seniors graduating and made them all accountants, you'd have a lot of unhappy kids 2 years down the road. And you can tutor them in accounting, and some people aren't good with numbers. Some people, my wife's an artist, that whole piece, she got both sections of that, that whole piece doesn't work for me. Some people are not good with numbers. Some people are always going to struggle, as adults, are always going to struggle with Gemara logic, and they'll be much more inclined to go to a shiur in Navi. And by the way, parenthetically, I think we should offer adults a greater menu of classes other than just Gemara. To offer classes in Navi, and many shuls and schools do, but I think there should be more of that in the rich canvas of tapestry of our heritage, of our Messiah. There's a lot of learning that would appeal to people who don't do well with Gemara. That doesn't mean they shouldn't learn it, but they're not naturally inclined to it and will be less likely to do it. So if you have any questions, thoughts, disagreements, please feel free to post comments. If you'd like me to give another class in a similar area, again, post it on the comments here. Feel free to. I also have a forum on thebrightbeginnings.com. Again, it's www.thebrightbeginnings.com. There are 50 forum leaders. It's in beta now. We're actually launching this Monday. A week from Monday. So if you have any questions that you'd like to pose to me, just go right to my forum and pose it there. Or look at the tapestry of experts that we have there on bereavement counseling and acclimating Balei Tshuva and abuse prevention and substance abuse, anti-bullying programs, job training, whatever you could imagine. There are so many different experts that could help you if you have issues that you'd like to deal with. Thank you very, very much for listening again. I really hope you found this helpful. Have a great day and an easy fast.